But what I was trying to say is that, yeah, we sort of, because for in the initial stages, cooking didn't start until about 1.5 million years ago. By then, we'd already been upright for at least about a million years. We'd grown bigger brains with basically all that, and that was all on fat. Um, and then cooking came around, but still, tubers in the old days, you have to understand modern tubers are not the same. Get your head out of that. African tubers are basically these very fibrous things. How people eat and get a bit of starch, very little starch. There's not a lot of starch in these African tubers. What they do is they suck on and they throw the fiber away. So they just suck on the actual, they cut them up in these strips with a lot of fiber and they suck on this sort of stuff and then they throw it away. Mary explained it in one of the videos, or either one of my live chats or one of the videos that we did together on the Maasai and all that. And that's how they get rid of this sort of stuff in the Hadza. So you don't get a lot, but that additional small amount of energy is better than nothing, especially if you're struggling. So humans did, until we get to agriculture where we cultivate. Now I need to make all that clear. Until we get into agriculture and we domesticate tubers, only then do we get these big, massive tubers that are less fibrous and have got a lot of starch. Prior to that, they are very smaller, really small little things. It's it's more like, they look more like, they're not even tuber size. They look more like, like a fatter a fatter carrot or something like that. They funny shaped and all that. It's so they're very fibrous. So you don't have a lot of nutrition. They usually suck them and throw away. That's how they do it. Even today, the Hadza still do it. Seasonally, when they have seasonally, and that's a couple of months in the year when they get access, because they've got nowhere to store it. And when something has fiber, if you put it in the fridge and it's got fiber, it becomes mushy. If you try to store it with a lot of fiber, it degrades. It's not doesn't where the modern day tubers, if you store them in a dry place, and these sort of areas are the variable weathers and all that, they've got no storage capacity like we have in modern you know the modern agricultural society, which had all these structures where they could store things in dry places. These are tribal people. They don't have these, you know, building structures to be able to store things. We use today storage silos and stuff like that. They had certain, basically mud brick type structures that they stored this sort of stuff to keep it dry and off the ground. So it wouldn't basically, insects couldn't get to it. And at the same time, it would remain dry and aerated in a cool place. And that's how they preserved in early agriculture this sort of stuff before refrigeration, by drying it out and all that. But they were domesticated. The old is very, so you only get a bit of seasonal starch to suckle on it and get a bit of glucose from it. You throw that away, and fruit, which was about 1 to 2 months, depending on the latitude you were in the world, where you'd get access. And they were very small, fibrous, with a bit of fructose and stuff like that. Not very, we're not talking about here. Even bananas, if you take a look, they were little things like that with a lot of fibers and seeds in them. Today's are seedless. They're clones. They're not the same. So watermelons used to be this tiny stuff that just sat in your palm. Comes from Africa, watermelon, just a little thing in your palm, very fibrous. And all you do is you get the fluids out. It's like a hydration thing rather than a food. Then modern day watermelons, this big, completely different. One domesticated, one not. Very difficult. We need to get our mindset, our brains out of domesticated foods and animals, in particular plants, and stop thinking about plants in the modern way. They're not the same. Completely different. So when we talk about small amounts of plants being consumed by tribal societies, we're talking about small amounts, and we're talking about highly fibrous. They don't consume the fiber, they just try and get whatever is in between the fiber, some of the actual energy, which is basically in terms of glucose, or some fructose to fatten up by engaging the Randle cycle at a low grade. And that's how they put on a bit of adiposity to survive the lean periods where they've got less access to animal fat. That's how they survived in the modern. And in prior to that, when the animals were in the glacial periods and had more subcutaneous fat because they had to protect themselves from the cold, well, under those circumstances, what they did was they were able to basically access much greater quantities of fat, so they didn't need to worry about plant sources of energy. That's the difference, you know. So think not in terms of modern food, because that's the problem. People think in terms of modern food and they don't think about what the foods really look like. I say to people, Google what a watermelon looked like. Google what a broccoli looked like. Google any of these things, what they look like originally, the wild forms, and you'll be shocked how fibrous and very little sugar they have in comparison. So yeah, it's a lot of nonsense out there. Need to be very, very careful about all that sort of nonsense because even in today's environment, which is an interglacial period, which is quite a warm period, even in this sort of period, there's very little. Most of your energy is going to come from two-legged creatures, and most of your protein is going to come from two-legged creatures. The other stuff is sort of like, a bonus. That's all. Nothing else. And they prioritize the hunt and the meat. Even, Mary saw that going out with the Hadza in some of the hunts, which they go up to 4 hours in some cases till they find something. So yeah, very different until you actually live amongst them and see exactly, sleep with them and live amongst them and see exactly how they live day to day, which researchers don't do. They just go, oh, here's a questionnaire. It's inconvenient. I'm an academic. I can't live like a peasant or like a tribal person in squalor. They're living somewhere else. They just turn up, get the questionnaires and ask them questions and all that. She actually lived amongst them to actually really see what life is like to be somebody like that. That gives you a greater insight than some bullshit questionnaire, which people don't even understand from those societies. Yes, this is what I'm saying. And then they just make up shit because they adjust everything, as we know. What a world we live in. What a world.